Welcome to Surfacing. In this Surfacing Deep Dive, Andy asks Lisa about digital governance, what it is, what it isn't, and how solid governance practices support the product design and development process.
Lisa, when we were talking to Christina Podner, it was fascinating to hear about policies and guidelines. And, as we've talked, I would really love to talk more about governance and understanding what brings that all together. It's been an area that, I feel like I dip a toe in, especially since I know you and I try to be the good steward of, who's making these decisions and what does it look like? But I'd love to really understand it more.
I think I can talk about that at length.
That's perfect. I'm really even just the definition of governance. You hear governance thrown around all the time, and it's I don't know that everybody has a clear definition of what it is. It's this blanket statement. I remember I was telling you, I was talking about, hey, if we're gonna build this brand guideline, we should figure out a way to hold everyone accountable to using it the right way. We should govern it. And some of the reactions are well, we want to give everybody the freedom to kind of do their own thing with it. And my thought was, if everyone then has ownership in it, nobody really does. So would love to hear more about, did I say the right thing? What does that look like?
I think a good way for me to start is to just put some context around the different types of governance that I interact with, and then to talk specifically about digital governance, which is my area of expertise. So, when I first started doing this kind of work, I called it web governance, right? Because mostly I was talking about organizations that had really, really big websites and really, really big web teams that were scattered all over the world, and they weren't organized enough to get the work done. And I was also dealing a lot with some infighting between the marketing team and usually IT around who had sort of ownership and control over the online presence, which when I first started it was mostly websites. Right. There was no social media, there were no mobile apps. And so as things grew bigger and social media and mobile apps came into the picture, I started to talk about digital governance. I still have folks who say web governance. To me, web governance is governing the World Wide Web. So there is such a thing as web governance, and that's things that, Tim Berners-Lee, who's one of the inventors of the World Wide Web, has a World Wide Web Foundation, and they deal with a lot of policy work around web, and also another governance that's out there, which is internet governance, which is governance of the internet. So if you think about those things, so internet like feeds and speeds, network compatibility, net neutrality, that's kind of the world of internet governance. Also things that happen at the national level. How open is the internet? Are you allowed to shut the internet down for citizens or not shut the internet down? Those are all things that happen in different ways around the world. Who has access to the internet? Is it available to everyone? I don't know if it's you who told me or I just know from paying attention from time to time. I think just now we've passed the mark where over 50% of the world population has access to the internet, right? So internet governance, and then web governance, which is, in my brain, the World Wide Web. And so that's the world of W3C, right, and web standards, and that interacts with internet governance, right? So none of these things are pure lanes because we're all talking about a set of technologies that work together. And so where do I fit in that, and where does the governance that I'm talking about? And that's why I call what I do digital governance, because I'm usually talking about the way that an enterprise uses internet and web technologies to either make money, meet their mission, whatever it is they're trying to do. So that's just sort of a frame of what I'm talking about. Now, once we've gotten into that sort of swimming pool of stuff that I'm talking about, digital governance inside of an organization, what am I trying to help people achieve? I'm trying to help people have a collaboration model for their digital team so that they can get work done intentionally, right? So not accidentally, not weird off the cuff, but just say, we have a strategy, right? And we're trying to do X. And X might be, push people down the sales funnel or save lives or have somebody's medical records, retrievable across multiple hospitals or whatever the case may be. What's the best way to get the team organized and to have certain policies and standards in place so that we can get that work done collaboratively, effectively, and safely? So That's it, right? So what people think it is often is workflow. Right. Or when I'm implementing something, is somebody going to be looking over my shoulder and saying I can let it go or not let it go? And, workflow is important, and standard operating procedures, as we were talking about with Christina, that's all important, but that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm like, are you engineered? Is your digital factory engineered to actually get work done that you need to get done? Or are you just working randomly? Right. And so the answer is most people are just working randomly or in an accidental way that they've gotten used to. And so the domain of digital governance is really just getting organized so that you can work with intent. Right. And it's surprising how many folks aren't.
Right. No, that makes total sense. And I love that you brought it from internet to World Wide Web, because then my brain went, well, what about the intranet? And then you went to digital governance, which enables the teams that build those. Because, my teams work on external facing, internal facing, mobile. There's a layer, like we talked about with Ron Bronson, of service design and our communications channels and what that looks like. And really, we've got a series of processes. I could imagine you're probably laughing already on the inside of like there's a design process and a product process and an engineering process of how they deliver, and then there's a legal process, and like it feels like it's a lot of, all right, here's where we're at. I'm going to go over to you and see if this aligns. It doesn't align. I'm going to come back. Like it's a lot of chaotic swirl, maybe because we don't have the right governance. I'm going to say framework, thinking that's the right word. Maybe we don't have the right governance framework in play.
Yeah, well, of course it's framework. I mean, I've written a whole book on how to write a governance framework, so I'm smiling because you said the F word, the right F word. And so, yeah, I mean, here's the thing. People, when you do governance work, people think you're sort of like tight, control freak or whatever. And yeah, certain aspects of me are. But honestly, I just want teams to be able to work effectively together and in positive environments and not doing work that ends up getting shut down at the 11th hour because it's off, but you didn't, check to see that. So, all of these things are important, and all of these internal silos have domain expertise. The team that creates online experiences, and let's just stick with online experiences, even though most experiences cut across online, real world, physical world, Internet of Things. But even if we just stick with a pure play online experience, the number of competencies required to get that done appropriately is a lot, right? And so, when I go inside of an organization, what I see, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, which is the biggest challenge, is that each one of those areas of expertise, whether it's front-end design, visual design, content strategy, the network server infrastructure folks or the coders, our hardcore coders, they all want to just jump in front and say their part's the most important. And so there's this just submission that needs to happen, and this admission that it's all important, and that any one of those pieces being weak isn't going to help the overall outcome of the product or service that you're designing. So what I'm really trying to achieve is getting people to understand that and getting the team organized in a way that when it's important for the voices of visual design to dominate, they do. And when it's important for the voice of code or even say privacy or data protection to be dominant, it is, right? And so it's really just a more subtle activity. And I think we've gotten into this sort of superstar mode of, like the superstar algorithm maker or the superstar designer or the superstar content strategist. And it's just like, it's just as bad as when we used to, and some people still do, design websites that were based around the organizational structure, right? You go to the homepage and you basically see the org structure, and it doesn't help a customer, right? So, but what these teams are doing is really something really similar, which is they're making the user submit to their work dynamic, right? Right? They're not really user-centered. They're like me and my domain expertise centered. And so that's never going to create a really good outcome. And so cutting across that, and to a certain extent, it's a maturity issue, right? It's, we don't really know what these jobs are. We, beat our chests and twirl and, spray sparkle dust and say that we do, but we really don't know what we're doing. And so I think there needs to be some kind of admission in that. But I don't know. I mean, what do you think about when you've been talking to me so long now, I feel like I've indoctrinated you into the world of governance. But, before meeting me, what did you think? If somebody had said governance, what would you have thought?
I would have thought a RACI. We've got to have a RACI so that we understand who's touching what, who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. And we still kind of do that from time to time. I often see, you mentioned it earlier, this play of like design and marketing, because now as design's kind of evolved to where it's split between marketing design and product design, we could go over to something like a client communication or an email. Which content team owns that? Is it in the product? Is it that product team? Or is it that marketing team that does the way the brand communicates externally? So, there's always this back and forth, and sometimes the RACI is the easiest way to at least understand each other's perspective and who's going to, have what role on what piece of the work. But other than that, I mean, it always felt like, and even in large organizations, it felt like it came down from above of like, here's this governance framework, here's this governance model that we're going to use. And it's always, well, can we do things a different way? Maybe. Who holds us accountable to that? Who owns it? Well, you can't do that because it affects technology. So it always felt like it was a thing we pointed to as a way of working, but everyone always seemed to find a way around that of working, and it was never really enforced until shit went off the rails. Then it's like, hey, we have this governance framework, like you have to follow this and that won't happen again. So in that world, like and we think autonomous teams, so who's the one that's really holding that team accountable for living within that framework?
Yeah, so you've said a couple of really interesting things that both of which make me smile. One is you said RACI. So a governance framework for me, the way that I think about it and work with it, is a very simplified RACI. That's all it is. It's a grid, and it says who, not who or what part of the organization or what individual, depending on how specific you want to get, is accountable for defining the strategy for getting something done. So that's, qualitatively, what are we trying to achieve? And quantitatively, from a measurement perspective, what are we trying to achieve? Who is accountable for making that definition, right? And I would say 80% of the time, at least, I'm going 80-20, but probably higher in real play, that particular aspect is not clear. It's really not clear. And then the other one is policy, and we talked to Christina Podner about policy. Who is accountable for making sure that you know what policy you should have, and then specifically for each policy that you should have, who's accountable for defining it, right? And then third, who is responsible for understanding what set of standards you need to actually make a quality portfolio, right? And then who writes each of those standards. So you notice what's not in there. There's nothing in the governance framework that says, and you must work like this, and the
Right.
standard must say that. There's none of that, right? And so it's just going to say, if you're picking a color for something, go look over there because it may have already been selected if it's a brand related color, right? Or if you're not sure if something's right, there's the place that you go to ask that question. Right? And then
Right.
you have a conversation. It's not saying you have to do this many. It's not even defining necessarily what the portfolio of products and services needs to be. It's just saying
Right.
things like, if there's a pattern library, it's defined here, right? And making sure that there are mechanisms in place to make sure that all of those standards and policies are always up to date, right? So it's a separate job. Right?
Right.
It's not. And so I think people push all that governance stuff together with the day-to-day work. And that's why it's definitely like a cluster F. I mean, honestly, it's like they're making stuff and trying to make things, but they've got this really narrow view. And so if you just pull it up a level and you have someone whose job it is to go like, what standards do we actually need here right now to make the things we make? Right?
Right.
And that person's job is to look around and say, oh, okay, we need this particular thing for front end development. I'm going to go over there and ask that person that's really an expert, can you generally kind of give us a standard of things that we need to do? And it could be very light. And it could be that people who are actually doing the day-to-day week have a high level of autonomy about how that plays out. Or maybe not. Maybe it's very, very specific because it needs to be, because you're dealing with some personally identifiable information and it's super tight or whatever the case may be. And so I think people think that governance is just about like somebody looking over them and or holding onto their hand while they're trying to draw and saying, no, you can't do that. And you can't. It's not. It's just knowing where those control mechanisms are. And that's why we're in trouble. The fact that we don't have those things. And the last piece that you said was really about enforcement. If you don't know who's making the decision or who's writing the policy or the standard or the strategy, how do you know if you went off the rails? Like it's just
Right.
sitting, it's nowhere, right? Like the accountability mechanism is nowhere. And so, and you know, in a case like I'll call them out in Facebook, it's just ludicrous. I'm sure if you looked on their books that their policy reads kind of okay. Right? It probably
Right.
says most of the right things, but it's poorly implemented and there's no enforcement or accountability mechanisms. It rolls straight
Right.
up into the top of the organization and it's weak. It's just like the governing mechanisms are weak. And then when they have the chance, right, they do this outside organization, right? We're going to get these people from the outside to make these governance decisions because we don't want to make them, right? So It's just really interesting. But anyhow, that's me blathering on. As you know, I can talk about this stuff a lot, but
Yeah, you know that makes me think. Well, I remember when we met and we were talking about governance. I was probably told you that at one point in my career I worked for a financial services company, and we were involved in creating some sort of digital. I honestly, now that I think back to it, it was probably some sort of governance document. But the way it worked is there was a centralized organization in the company that once a year would send you this document, and you had to review your piece, your piece of this 90-page document of like, this is the design piece. Go ahead and make sure that everything makes sense and it hasn't changed, and that the link to your like SharePoint document that explains how your team works and the contact person for your organization is there. But then the other thing that you said of being implemented poorly, so many times we see these documents created almost in a silo. And then what happens is they're stuck somewhere on a SharePoint site.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you have a question, go like find out where this is and look into it, and it doesn't become part of the way of working. Is that something that you see that's common? And how can companies kind of start to really take this governance framework and let it become part of how they naturally work?
Well, I mean, that's ops, right? And so, I'm always making fun of design ops all the time because like designers doing ops is funny to me for some reason or another. And I'm not dissing ops on designers or ops on that front, but it's the same front with governance. And so some of the more successful people that we've worked with, they understand that the maintenance of the set of policies and standards, particularly in a heavily evolving digital portfolio, right? Where just stuff changes. That's a job, right? So you can't have a designer whose job it is to be designing all day long also be the person responsible for making sure that other designers are trained on design standards, are, whatever. That person could do that job of training others,
Right.
but they can't do that and be a full-time designer. So this
Right,
idea
exactly.
of having a governance framework and having policies and standards, also other things related to governance and operations, which is, are you effectively managing your portfolio of vendors who are supporting you? Right? Like if you have certain standards, are the standards that you have in place part of their contract? The fact that they need to uphold those standards? Are they part of the service level agreement? These are all things that are really super important, can create efficiencies, help you save money, drag down the noise level for people on the team. But the organization somehow expects the designers to do it, or the front end developers are to do it, or they don't expect that, or the content strategy person to do it. The part of the organization that actually knows how to do this already and that often gets dissed as being slow and a pain in the butt is IT. Right? Like IT, because they are longer lived than digital. Digital teams often are seated sort of in marketing, which is not the greatest place from my personal opinion. It's because it's so visual. It's just, but it's so visual, and there was such a strong marketing push to early digital, early website development. It was largely just talking about the business and the products and services that you provide. It was very sales and marketing focused. But as things get embedded deeper and you actually have service design and are offering services, you're actually talking about the scope of the entire organization. Right? And so that's why it's so challenging when those things are sitting in marketing, because marketing people oftentimes don't really understand the business. Right? I mean, I know that that might sound harsh, but I don't mean it in a harsh way. It's just true, right? And so they understand a lot about marketing, and oftentimes they're at odds with sales even, and those two people are supposed to be walking in lockstep. So, but the IT team, is used to servicing the broader organization. They're used to negotiating big contracts with vendors. They're used to having expectations about what those vendors will achieve and embedding those into a contract. Now, they also have some habits that make them sometimes not the fastest, right? And so, and they also kind of don't really want to get involved in content. Right? Like there's a line that they've drawn. And so what that ends up being is there ends up being this gap between what marketing knows how to do and what IT knows how to do. And unfortunately, what's in that gap is most of digital.
Right.
Right? Like marketing campaigns on one side, network and server stuff, and maybe some coding on the other side, although that's starting to shift out of IT as well as front-end development gets more and more sort of content-y and more designy approach to it. So you've got this whole pile of stuff in the middle that nobody knows who's running it. Nobody knows who's supposed to make the rules. And that's how you create the mess. I mean, it's insane. I mean, do you agree with that? I mean, like, it's just...
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of muddy parts that don't. It's like an island of misfit toys that's somewhere in the middle of all these different disciplines, and then you realize, well, there are front end developers on the design systems team, there are front end developers on the product team, there are front end developers on the engineering team, or maybe the engineering team doesn't use front end developers anymore because they have full stack developers, and then the design team realizes, hey, like these are off. You're not really building the way we intended for this to be. The grid is off, and now we need to bring in our own front-end developers so that they can communicate the design to code. So that's definitely one piece of it that I see. The other thing that's really interesting in this space is, like, now I work in a company that's decently large, number one lender. So what we've got is, like, our procurement process, our, like, negotiating contracts, like, a lot of that currently falls on me, although I do have a design ops person. I have a partner in what we call product strategy ops that handles a lot of the vendor relationships, and like our sourcing person's been amazing. I've gotten contracts signed within like a week or two, where in other organizations it's like 9 months, 10 months. So seeing that speed is great, and having that partner is great. So to me, when we talk operations, and I'd love to have a chat with somebody that does design operations all day. It's everything that you mentioned, but through a design lens, because thinking of how the team can be more efficient in their process, it takes someone that understands how a design team works and how design works to be able to figure out how to make that team hum at the right, the right pace. And then when we get to something like working with talent acquisition, having someone on the design side to help rewrite job descriptions that understands them and can work with the team to do comp analysis. So it's just, as design becomes this more, in a digital company now, if we think about the triad, it's really like product, design, and engineering. So as design's got this seat at the table we've all been asking for, now we need people that understand how we work to make us work better. And they look at things through our own eyes for operations, because how many times I've I want to use this design tool and it's blocked, right? And then you're like, hey, what about this? Well, what are you using it for? Is there going to be customer data on it? So all of those decisions, it's easier to have someone that understands design to be part of that, as opposed to taking away from the team that's doing what you said, their day-to-day job, because that creates a ton of inefficiency.
Well, it's also not their competency.
Right, exactly.
I mean, to me, that's really what it comes down to. I mean, someone can evolve from being a designer. It's sort of like, you're a manager of a large group, right? And so, or you're leading a large team, or whatever language you want to use. And so you probably don't do a lot of hands-on designing, right? That's fine. You evolved as an individual. But so I'm not talking about that. That can happen and should happen and needs to happen more. We actually need people who are designers and who work in the digital space to evolve into senior leadership positions, because because they'll just be informed. They'll just be better, right? And so I think that's really important. But I'm also just hearing, and I've mentioned this maybe a couple times already on some of the podcasts, this is just, the evolution of the enterprise. We're in this deep belief system that we think we can keep the same basic organizational structure that we had prior to the web and the internet being a large part of what business does, and that we can just keep going with a siloed IT, with a siloed marketing, with and the silos that go within that silo. And so I'm not saying that it's an easy solution, but I'm saying that, design now is different than what design was. And IT now is different than what IT was. And there's this whole new discipline of digital, of enterprise digital, which pulls in odd things like the competencies that were usually associated with things like records management, which involve metadata and taxonomy development, tagging things for storage and retrieval, right? And the fact that people who do front-end development and product design don't understand that is part of the reason why things that are personalized end up with data and privacy concerns. Right?
Exactly.
So there are just all of these superficial ways to attack things that, when it's only design focused and you push everything else back, is problematic. So yes, you need the support so that you can get the contracts that you need, but also there just needs to be a broader conversation in the digital sphere amongst digital makers about what is it that we're actually trying to do, and what is the right way to organize and support these things, even at an executive level, right? So, I have mixed feelings about Chief Digital Officer. I don't know that we need that, but this conversation of what does an enterprise look like when it's heavily impacted by online experiences, or when it's managing things that are predominantly online experiences. We've basically taken old models. We were talking about this with Ron Bronson and service design, taking an old process and porting new stuff on it. Right. Well, that's what we've done in the enterprise. We've okay, we have this business tree. It's got a chief operating officer, a CEO, a chief marketing officer, and a CIO, and maybe some corporate legal and finance. Right. We've got these things. We're going to make that model work, even though this business has been completely disrupted. We're going to keep those same old-fashioned stuff. And so that's the conversation that needs to happen. And there's nothing a designer can do about that.
I think those conversations are starting to happen. They're not happening as often as we probably would like, but I do have faith that those are happening as companies are realizing like the old way of doing business just doesn't work today. And to stay ahead and continue to either outpace the competition or figure out how to leapfrog them, we have to figure out how to organize our teams to be more effective in today's world.
Yeah, and that is the last component of creating a governance framework. There's the RACI chart of decision making, and then there's also being very specific about the team, right? So if I ask folks, who's on your team? If I'm talking to a design person, they'll literally talk as if design is the sun and everything else is orbiting it, right? If I talk to IT, they'll speak about it as if IT's the sun, marketing's the sun, products the sun, or whatever. And none of them are wrong. Like they're all there, and there is this sort of constellation of things happening. But really, the business and what it's trying to achieve is the sun, right? And so thinking about it in that context and really understanding who is on the team. And when I say team, I mean, 4 different levels of team. I mean, who's making the rules? So those rules that in that RACI that I just described, strategy, policies, and standards, who's doing that? And then who's actually doing the work, right? Sometimes there's some overlap, and that's a huge number of people who are actually deploying stuff. Who are those people? Then the next level of team is, and how do those people collaborate at all levels? How do you make sure there's an alignment at the executive level? How do you make sure there's alignment at the working level? And how do you just make sure that everybody who works there broadly understands what you're trying to achieve online, whether you put your hands in it or not? And then the last component, and this is the one that nobody ever thinks of as team, are just your vendors, right? Sometimes people have outsourced everything to a strategic vendor of record, and they do very little internally. And so making sure that you know who's in that array, as well as who are other people outside of your array, outside of your organization that impact you heavily. So you've always talked about how you've always worked in environments that are heavily regulated, right? So there's just things you have to pay attention to, right? To make sure that you're not breaking the law or you're in alignment, or maybe you have really strategic competitors, right? Where you're always paying attention to their stuff, right? So that's all part of the team mechanism. And so really having an understanding of who those folks are, so you can either watch them and monitor them or be informed by them when it's either a competitor or some policy or regulation, or so that you can communicate to them, right? So you can tell them, you know what, we're not doing this anymore. I remember very, very early on, I worked on a project, and for 2 years I worked with folks. And they were all about this Japan website and doing this and making sure we got, international this and that right for Japan. And as soon as they got the thing's content management system deployed, the executive level announced that they were selling off the Japanese component. Right? So that's kind of stuff. And and it wasn't that it was a secret. I mean, sometimes those are strategic and it's a secret and you don't announce them till 11th hour. I get that, right? But this was just bad internal communication, right? So, middle management knew. They just hadn't bothered to tell anybody on that team. And so a lot of times there's just a lot of disconnection amongst that array. And so, if I can leave a team knowing who's on their team and who needs to talk to who and when, and knowing who makes decisions, that's most of it. The rest of it will be taken care of by expertise at the, product development level, right? People making things, and they can figure out their own workflow. If somebody wants to work in Agile because that works, great. If somebody doesn't, or they want to do some modified version of Agile, that's fine too. Governance isn't telling you the speed in which to operate. It's just telling you where the rule-making mechanisms are. And the rest of it's sort of up to you to figure out what's culturally appropriate for you to do in terms of a collaboration model. So yeah, there's just a lot of stuff going on. I honestly think that, it's funny, I've been doing this for quite some time, and as I start to sit back a little and do more coaching of folks and teaching other people to do kind of the work that I do, I think we're kind of at a moment where everyone's like, wow, this is really messed up. And maybe we actually need to start thinking about this in a more mature manner, and the more strategic work you were alluding to, which is just organizations going, wait, wow, the web really is here, and the internet really is here, and it really is embedded in our cars and our dishwashers, and it's in my child's hand almost from the day they were born. And how are we going to get organized and move away from this sort of factory cookie cutter car making model, right? Which is what I think, or industrial model that we had, which really informed how enterprises were structured, and move into something new. And I think with the pandemic is even more fascinating because now the workers are even more dispersed, right? So that scrum, that stand-up meeting, what is that when you're not in the same room? Right. There's just a lot of things that are really kind of fun and fascinating. So I guess you can do that, via video teleconference, but it changes the dynamic.
Right. And a lot of companies they went digital and didn't put anything in place of how they should work now. Like we're trying to mimic the office as best as we can, but we're not. So, that leads me to think about a question without wanting you to give away any secret sauce of how you solve these problems. A lot of it is, so there are people in an organization that identify that something's wrong. What's the best way for them to really raise that awareness wide enough or broad enough or deep enough or high level enough in the organization that they're like, you know what? We really do need to figure out how to fix this.
Yeah, well, the good news on that is I think that and I think we touched on this with our episode with Mike Montero. The mess is out there now, right? It used to be that there weren't really any big digital messes. That's not entirely true, but how about this? They weren't big enough for people who were super just push to pay much attention. But I think poorly architected and unconsidered big systems that are online have done real harm, right, to society. And so I think folks' eyes are open. I think there's some blind spots in that mechanism. A lot of that's happened in the political arena or with news or with social media. And I know from working with folks, particularly in B2B, that there are issues in that as well, that are harder to surface and harder to see, but they sort of have the same types of dynamics. So one way to get people to pay attention is to sort of have a disaster. And that's happened to some people, right? And so, I'm laughing, but that's often what happens. And we've talked about, when we were talking about safety, we talked about car manufacturing for a long time. And the fact that the harm caused by the lack of seatbelt wearing was apparent from day one. And it took over 80 years for seatbelts to be mandatory, at least in the US, right? And it took 70 some years. I might be off on my years a little bit, but something around that for them to be required in cars, right? So there's just this period of time where people just don't get it. And so I think if you are a maker, right, day to day, just sort of making things, and you're wondering what you can do, I think that's the part where I just have to say, you do your best work, right? If you are designing something and you see the opportunity for there to be harm, or if you're on a team and you're saying, this is the third time we've been wondering about what font we should use, right? Raise those issues, right? And start that conversation where you are. If you're in a management position where you have some influence, you can maybe have that conversation be even broader. Say you're heading up a design team. You can talk about things like a design system, but then don't make the mistake of thinking that that's the only center of the universe.
Right, or the only solution too.
Right, or the only solution. So maybe if you're in that position, go and look for your other partners in other parts of this mechanism, whether or not it's IT or the business or whatever, area you're in, other aspects of product design, and find out where their standards bodies are, right? Because they have them too. They're having the same problems down their silos. And then look and see, like, how much of this stuff is the same? Can we at least put it in a similar repository? Is it written down? Are they in alignment, right? And I think one of the most powerful things, if you're at the top of an organization, and I'm sure those people probably aren't listening to this podcast, but I interact with those folks a lot. They really like it when their team comes to them with a solution.
Right, exactly.
So if you can be aligned and say, look, we haven't figured it out completely, but there's an opportunity here for us to create efficiencies and create better products and services if we get in alignment about some of these decisions around standards. Or we've got 4 different standards for the same thing, right? And they say, we've got a plan to solve this or to unify this. They're very excited, particularly if you can put numbers to it. And numbers don't always mean necessarily making more money, but if you can just quantify why it's of value to them, or why it's of value to the organization, that's really helpful. So I think that's what can happen at any level in an organization. And if you are at the top of the organization, being open to real organizational change and deep organizational change, which is hard. If the business is hopping, you're kind of like, why change stuff? The numbers are good. That person's usually accountable to a board of directors that's looking at the profitability of the organization. And that's real. That's not a pretend thing. That's real, and that's how everybody gets paid, right? So I think everybody's got their challenge at various levels. So that was a lot, but I hope robust enough.
Yeah, no, I think the takeaway from that really, especially from makers, is to get out of your silo, because chances are someone else that you engage with and interact with is going through a very similar thing. And if there's a way to align or come to a common solution, it's a lot easier to get that done than it is to have all these one-off things that everybody's trying to do. So really the way to change the way the organization works is to figure out how you work with people and start figuring out what you need to be better, and raise those concerns to leadership, to your leaders, and hopefully they can have wider conversations and that influence can continue to grow.
Yeah, embody the, it's a little trite, but, be the change. It really, it's an important thing to do. So, yeah. So that's governance to me.
Awesome. Yeah, this has been great.
Did you learn anything, or did you already know all the Lisa stuff?
I knew, from talking to you, I've known quite a few of these things, but, a lot of people don't. So I think it's really valuable for people to hear that, especially people that haven't, talked to you every week like I have. So I got to understand a lot more than most designers already. And I think it's a valuable learning lesson for designers to be aware. And not just designers, anyone in the organization.
Groovy. Well, coming up soon, it's going to be Turnabout is Fair Play.
Perfect.
So get your design chops. Get your design chops ready. I'm going to ask you some basic questions about design that might seem really super easy for you, maybe for the next deep dive, but maybe aren't common knowledge for people, particularly folks on the business side.
Right. Perfect. Looking forward to it.
Okay, groovy.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy surfacing, please rate, review, and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, consider supporting the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/surfacingpodcast. If you have suggestions for guests or a topic you'd like to hear about on surfacing, please reach out via the contact form found at surfacingpodcast.com.